Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello there, good morning. Sky News can now reveal the full details of the government's own assessment of the economic impact of Brexit. Detailed analysis from across Whitehall shows the increase in costs to international trade across every sector of the economy. They suggest costs could rise by as much as 20% in the retail and wholesale industries, 13% in the motor vehicle trade and 16% in food, drink, defence, health and education. The government's figures also show the expected impact on every region and nation of the UK, with the North East at risk of a 16% drop in its local economy. We'll have more on those figures in a moment. First, our political editor Faisal Islam has our main report.
Revealed to Sky News the government's own numbers briefed to the Cabinet on how Brexit could hit the size of the economy in every region and nation of the United Kingdom, and also hike costs in every industrial sector too. Every number in the internal Cabinet briefing, already disowned by the Prime Minister, has now been passed to Sky News, and the picture is bleak across the country. In a no-deal scenario, the figures show that Northern Ireland could see its economy 12% smaller than otherwise in a decade and a half. But the hardest hit area with the strongest goods trade with Europe is the northeast of England, potentially a 16% hit, not much reduced even with a trade deal. The northwest could face a 12% hit, says the government, and the nations of both Wales and Scotland face a 9% no-deal hit.
Our ability to be able to sell these products and services to our European neighbours is going to be curtailed by the fact that we're no longer in the single market or customs union, and it's going to mean less growth, it's going to mean less jobs, and it's going to actually mean that we're going to end up a lot poorer than we would have been if we stayed inside the single market and customs union, or if we stayed in the EU.
Puzzling the Cabinet today, the question of the Irish border. How to make fit the UK leaving the customs union with having promised no hard border on the island of Ireland. The Cabinet's Brexit subcommittee meeting to try to complete the picture of its position. Sky sources saying even with a free trade deal, the hit in Northern Ireland over a decade and a half could be 8%. The Prime Minister has already downplayed the headline numbers from this, the work of her own officials, saying they don't account for the government's plan, nor have they been signed off by ministers. At Prime Minister's questions, she dismissed a question on Northern Ireland from the Brexit Committee Chair Hilary Benn.
Could the Prime Minister explain to the House why she is so opposed to the UK remaining in a customs union with the EU, when not only would this be better for the British economy than a vague, deep and special partnership, whatever that is, but would help to ensure that that border remains as it is today, which is what all of us want?
The United Kingdom is leaving the European Union. That means we're leaving the single market, we're leaving the customs union, because if we were full members of the customs union, we would not be able to do trade deals around the rest of the world, and we're going to have an independent trade policy and do those deals.
This is far from just being about the regions and nations. Sky News has also obtained the full sectoral breakdown of the costs of new frictions in the post-Brexit trade between the UK and Europe, as calculated by the government itself. The so-called non-tariff barriers, already explored by Sky News' Brexit Forensic series, show an increase in costs in agriculture of between 8 and 17%, in the retail and wholesale sector of 16%, and in the crucial motorcar industry of between 5 and 13%. These sectoral impact numbers for so-called non-tariff barriers are arguably the most important figures. They drive all the rest of them, and they fundamentally show that when the government says they want trade with our biggest partner, Europe, to be as frictionless as possible, that nonetheless means friction. And that is food for thought for the War Cabinet meeting and pondering exactly where we're going with our customs and trade options. Also, the Prime Minister will be hosting the executives of Japanese companies, including car companies such as Nissan. Faisal Islam, Sky News.
Well, as Faisal was reporting, the figures provided to Sky News cover all regions and nations of the UK, as well as all the major sectors of the economy. The government's figures suggest London would fare best. If the UK stays in the single market, the local economy will fall by less than 1%. If we leave the EU with no deal at all, the capital will see a 3% drop. But the rest of the country suffers far more. The West Midlands can expect a drop of 2.5%, even if we stay in the single market. With no deal, the local economy there is predicted to shrink by 13%. But the North East, which backed Brexit most comprehensively, faces a 3.5% drop if we stay in the single market, but a 16% slump if Theresa May can't reach a Brexit deal. If we look at individual sectors, the picture is, if anything, even more stark. Take motor vehicles. The analysis suggests costs for the industry will increase by between 5 and 13%. The food and drink industries will see an increase in costs of 8 to 16%, even before any new tariffs are imposed. But worst hit would be the retail and wholesale sectors, where, according to the government's own figures, costs will jump between 7 and 20%. Well, Faisal has an update now from Downing Street.
No surprise that the government has already half disowned this analysis done by their own officials. This is new detail about how existing leaked figures, how they pan out across the regions, and it's not good news anywhere, but particularly bad news, if you believe these figures, in areas of high trade with the European Union, such as the northeast of England, such as Northern Ireland, the northwest and the West Midlands too. But I think the bigger figures, if anything, are the sectoral impacts that drive all the other figures, because what they say essentially can be boiled down to one word, which is friction. The government has made much of wanting a deal that's nearly frictionless with the European Union. As frictionless as possible is what the Prime Minister keeps on saying. What these figures show is across industrial sectors, from retail to car manufacturing to energy, that there are all sorts of regulations and barriers and customs checks and the like, that when you top them up and add them up, they do come up to considerable percentages in extra costs, the equivalent of what could be tariffs out of a free trade deal. And that is really important. It's important for the War Cabinet that's been meeting, that will continue to meet, discussing the end state for customs and trade, because it's the first acknowledgement that there is a trade-off between this new world of post-Brexit free trade deals with the US and China and what might be the damage to trade with our biggest partner in Europe. And that is something that the Cabinet has to come to a view on.
Government figures released by Parliament show economic forecasts of how different kinds of Brexit may affect the economy. The figures suggest all areas will suffer negative growth, and some of the most pro-Brexit areas will be worst affected. The figures have already been challenged, and come as the Prime Minister has been holding the first of two key meetings with senior ministers to try to agree the government's approach to the next stage of the Brexit negotiations. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, reports.
Cloistered in the Commons, ministers' cars parked up give away the private meeting in the Prime Minister's office in Parliament. The Cabinet trying to reach a compromise, continually pushed by Brexiteers to take a tough line towards the EU.
Would she be good enough to be very robust when discussing these matters in the Brexit committees? I'm sure she will be, in order to ensure that we repudiate any of these EU threats.
We will hear all sorts of things being said about positions that are being taken. What matters is the positions that we take in the negotiations as we sit down and negotiate the best deal. We've shown we can do that. We did it in December, and we're going to do it again.
One Number 10 insider told me the problem is everyone always wants something, and the Prime Minister must broker a deal in her own party before she can get on with the negotiations. Today, the Brexit Committee was discussing how to avoid bringing back the border between Northern and Southern Ireland without keeping the current customs arrangement that the Prime Minister has ruled out. What kind of immigration deal should be done with the EU that controls the numbers but gives business the staff they need? And tomorrow, the discussion will move on to how we do business in future.
Why are ministers still squirreled away in here having these conversations when we voted to leave in the summer of 2016? Well, the referendum didn't dictate exactly the relationship we'd have with the European Union after Brexit. So for months, the Tories have been in a tug of war. Should we stay closely intertwined with Brussels after we go, or make a more dramatic break? The EU and business are running out of patience as the UK takes its time to decide.
It would demonstrate to the world that the United Kingdom is not leaving Europe as we leave the EU.
Tory Remain rebels lined up this morning to push against the idea of a lurch away from the EU. They're outspoken, but a minority in their party. Their fears the country will be much worse off.
It's abundantly clear to me that there is no model which will satisfy all sections of the British public. And I believe, and I've said many times before, I believe a no-deal scenario would be bad for our economy.
MPs have now seen the government's forecasts of what could happen to different parts of the country if there's no deal. Over 15 years, the economy in London is forecast to be 3.5% smaller. In the West Midlands, that voted to leave, it would be 13% smaller. And in the North East, which also chose Brexit, hypothetically, it's the worst affected. The economy potentially 16% smaller than it's otherwise expected to be. Forecasts often turn out to be wrong. Very wrong. But the government is preparing to make big choices right now that will, for better or worse, affect us all. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Now, MPs have been told more about the potential effect of Brexit on different regions of the UK. They've been given further details of the government's controversial Brexit impact analysis. To Westminster now, and our political correspondent Romilly Weeks. So, Romilly, what have you learned from this?
Well, these figures weren't supposed to be for public consumption. The government only reluctantly showed them to MPs. Now that they have, we've got a clearer picture of what the government's own analysis suggests will be the impact of various forms of Brexit on different areas of the UK. And it's the northeast of England that comes out of this the worst, one of the areas that voted very heavily to leave the EU. They would have an 11% hit to their income, even if we managed to negotiate a free trade deal, rising to 16% if we crash out with no deal. True for the West Midlands too, the highest Leave voting area of all. The impact for them, a drop of 8% and 13%. Northern Ireland could have reason to feel particularly aggrieved because they voted strongly to remain, but the impact for them is tough too, a projected 8% and 12% hit to the economy there. When I spoke to the Prime Minister last week, she tried to dismiss this analysis by suggesting that it was incomplete and didn't even model her preferred outcome, which is a bespoke deal. But MPs who I've spoken to who've seen these figures say that there is a space for the bespoke option. They call it the Florence option in this report after the Prime Minister's Florence speech. But where there should be figures, there are only blanks. And that's because, of course, we have no clarity at all on what that bespoke deal would involve.
OK, Romilly Weeks at Westminster. Thank you.
Now, Theresa May and 10 of her senior cabinet ministers have spent the afternoon working out the government's policy on a future relationship with the EU after Brexit. Another meeting is scheduled for tomorrow. And this evening, more data has emerged from the Treasury's leaked assessment of the possible impact of Brexit on the economy. Our political correspondent Michael Crick is in Westminster. Michael, what does the data say?
Well, yes, this afternoon the Brexit subcommittee met here at Westminster. They discussed immigration and Ireland, and as you say, they'll be meeting again tomorrow to discuss other matters. As for these forecasts, well, what we've got today is a regional breakdown of the forecasts which were leaked to BuzzFeed last week. They suggested that over the next 15 years, growth would be significantly worse depending on each scenario that there might be after Brexit, whether we were to remain in the single market, whether there was to be a free trade deal, or whether there was to be no deal at all. Now, in terms of the regional breakdown, it shows that some regions will be particularly hard hit. The North East, for instance, if there's no deal, the forecast is over the next 16 years, growth will be 16% lower. The North West, 12% lower. The West Midlands, 13% lower. Those all regions which voted very strongly for Brexit. Northern Ireland, which voted for Remain, growth there over the next 15 years would be 12% lower.
Interesting. On another matter, apparently there's trouble for the Labour Party because of the remarks made by one of their Scottish MPs. Tell us more about that.
Well, yes, Hugh Gaffney, who was elected last June as he's a left-winger, elected for the MP, for Coatbridge, Christon and Bells Hill, has apologised today for making deeply offensive remarks at a student Burns Night dinner at Edinburgh University on Saturday, and has promised to attend equality and diversity training. Now, I'm not allowed to say exactly what he said at the Burns Night evening. He used a term, an offensive term for a homosexual in relation to Robbie Burns, and he also he spoke about being at home and eating a Chinese meal, only rather than say Chinese meal, he used a slang term for it. Mr. Gaffney says that he's vowed to do everything possible to make amends for his remarks. A Labour spokesman said that the Labour Party is clear this language is unacceptable, and that Mr. Gaffney has been reprimanded.
Michael, thanks.
Well, we've been debating and dithering for over a year, perhaps more dithering than debating. But one thing everybody agrees on now is that we can't go on delaying a choice. We have to tell the EU this is our vision of a new relationship. And annoyingly, it has to be a realistic vision at that. So it is crunch time, and these could be among the biggest days of Theresa May's premiership, because the Brexit Cabinet Subcommittee is thrashing out the arguments. Call it soft or hard Brexit, Norway or Canada. How do we finesse that stark choice? We'll rehearse some of the arguments they have undoubtedly been having, but a little briefing first. Here's Nick Watt.
From wars to peacetime, its grand corridors and gilded rooms have witnessed some of the great decisions in British history. Theresa May had assumed that she would stamp her mark on our history by shaping Brexit within the walls of Downing Street. And so today, ministers on the Cabinet's Brexit subcommittee gathered to discuss the nature of the UK's future relationship with the EU.
Progress was said to be slow today. One source close to a cabinet minister complained to me that it all had the feel of kicking decisions into the long grass. Another source expressed confidence that the cabinet as a whole would reach agreement by the end of the month. But today's meeting was held as senior Tories acknowledged that the cabinet is not the only source of power in shaping Brexit.
Beyond Downing Street, there are two other centres of power. Parliament may well have a significant say. Brexiteer Tories are already making their presence felt, but a combination of an evolving Labour Party and the House of Lords could force the government's hand in other ways. And then, of course, there is the EU, which appears to be playing hardball at the moment.
Until recently, it had been assumed that Parliament could at best take potshots at the government on Brexit. Now, pro-European MPs and peers have far grander ambitions. These parliamentarians want to amend the EU withdrawal bill in the House of Lords on access to the single market and on a customs relationship with the EU in a way that would be acceptable to the Labour Party and to pro-European Tories when the bill returns to the House of Commons. One source close to a cabinet minister told me there are Remain ministers who want Parliament to do their work for them.
These pro-Europeans believe they've been vindicated by a government assessment of the economic consequences of Brexit. A breakdown of the UK regions shows that under a no-deal scenario, the size of the economy in the Leave heartland of the northeast of England would be 16% smaller in 15 years compared with current forecasts. In the West Midlands, another Leave area, the figure would be 13%. London, a Remain stronghold, would be the least affected by slower growth. The government says these are provisional findings. And of course the EU will have its say. The European Commission is proposing sanctions to punish the UK during the transition period if it breaches EU rules. One cabinet minister told me it was a deliberately provocative negotiating ploy. The power to shape Brexit may well be spreading beyond Downing Street. For the moment, though, the ball sits with its current inhabitants.
Our political editor, Nick Watt, there, and Nick is with me. Come on, Nick, you must have some more intel on what went on inside that crucial meeting today.
Well, before we get to that, interesting speech this evening by the Prime Minister to the Conservative black and white ball. She said, ever since the British people delivered their vote in the referendum, I've had no doubt about what our new relationship with the EU must mean. Control of our money, control of our borders, and control of our laws. Now, what's she doing there? Knocking on the head the idea that she does not have a vision for Brexit. Now, the Prime Minister spoke this evening after the meeting of that Cabinet subcommittee in her office in Parliament, and I have to say I'm hearing some pretty gloomy accounts. One source close to a Cabinet Minister said to me there was a dreary reading out of pre-prepared scripts. Another source said to me the only thing they could agree on is that they disagree, but I have to say that Theresa May loyalists are saying they do not recognise those accounts and they are absolutely confident that there will be agreement.
Right. What is the choreography and timing? We had one meeting today, there's another one tomorrow. What is the process here?
So today was Northern Ireland immigration, tomorrow is the future relationship with the EU and the trade relationship with the EU.
Which is the big stuff. Really.
There is then due to be a third meeting later on this month, and the idea then is the full Cabinet will look and agree with what they have come up with, and that is to do two things. By the time that you have the EU Council at the end of March, there would be agreement between the UK and the EU on the implementation period. There are some difficulties on that at the moment. And then the other thing is for the UK to tell the EU what it wants for the future trade relationship so the UK can influence the Council guidelines that are then due to go to the European Commission.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. So the key decisions are about borders and regulation. Do we rebuild our own customs border with the EU? That's a border that allows us and the EU to monitor or tax our trade and perhaps have separate trade policies. How do we solve the Irish problem if we do that? On regulation, we won't be in the single market, but should we agree to align our product regulations with theirs so that any border checks on those regulations are minimal? Well, we have a panel of two commentators and two politicians from different perspectives. Jill Rutter is Programme Director for the Institute for Government. Dr. Andrew Lillico is Executive Director of Europe Economics. And then I'm also joined by the DUP MP, Ian Paisley. His party supported Brexit and support the government too. And the Conservative MP and former Attorney General Dominic Grieve, who was himself a Remain supporter. A very good evening to you all. Look, we're going to have a less dreary discussion than they obviously had today in the subcommittee. You hope. I'm going to get you, Ian Paisley, to set out your vision. What, if you were in there today, 40 seconds, what would be your kind of opening gambit on the trade relationship and regulatory relationship?
Well, frankly, I think the Prime Minister in her speech tonight has actually spelled it out. This is about control, about the British people being in control of their own destiny. And of course, we want to make sure that in any future relationship, we have a free trade relationship going forward with the EU, given that they have as much to lose in a bad deal as we have to lose. This is about getting a good deal for all of the British people, and we need to stop being so negative about this, so pessimistic.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to push you a bit.
I'm probably more loyal to the government than this man is at the present time.
I don't want to be political. I want to hear your practical suggestion for customs union and regulatory alignment. What is your pitch? Not to Theresa May, but what are you telling Theresa May to take to the Europeans?
Well, there's key things. First of all, we want to make sure that we get a really good fisheries deal. That is a key area for us.
But trade, the key things, trade and single market.
Well, trade, you know, at the end of the day, money makes the world go round. And trade here is going to determine the drive on politicians like us and on everyone else. They want to have a good trading deal and a good trading relationship.
Is Canada okay for you? If a Canada-type deal, is that?
Look, I think this is daft. I think if you get into this issue, it must be like Canada, it must be like Switzerland. What we need is a good bespoke deal in the United Kingdom.
Right. I'm going to ask the two of you, from what you've heard, how will the Europeans react to that, and does it make sense? Andrew?
I think that there is quite a lot of stated sympathy at the European level for having a free trade agreement, probably one that includes some services. Maybe they're not sure how much financial services they would want to include at this stage. There is some pushback about exactly what will happen about the Irish border.
We'll come to that.
But I think that the EU is willing to do that.
He's talking about a Canada-type deal, though. They would interpret that as Canada.
Yeah, or a Canada plus a few extra things. I think it's true that it won't be exactly like a Canada deal, and so politically you may not want to say it's exactly like a Canada deal, but I think it is broadly in that realm.
Negatives or positives of what that vision entails?
So, a Canada deal, the EU has free trade agreements with lots of countries. There's no reason why they shouldn't have a free trade agreement with the UK. What it does mean, though, is there's going to be quite a panoply of things at the border. It means we can run a different trade policy, we can have different tariffs. We're not applying the common external tariff, so there's a potential for tariffs at that border. That's an issue for Ireland that we need to work out. It's also would enable us to do trade deals with other countries, but then that means we might come out of regulatory alignment. So, for example, we had a lot of talk in the summer about doing a trade deal with the US. We know some of the things the US wants, like letting in agriculture regulated under their terms, very different from the EU's approach to regulation. The EU would want to make sure that the UK border, and in particular that border in Ireland, doesn't become a backdoor into the single market with different regulatory standards.
So it doesn't sound like you've solved the Irish problem with that one, or are there flying unicorns or something that get over
the Irish problem, as you just said, is basically a party political problem in the south of Ireland, where Fine Gael is trying to out
what's your solution? Are you saying there's no border
on this issue?
Under that?
It's not in the interest of the Republic of Ireland, who will remain in the EU, to have a troublesome border.
No, but they need to enforce the regulations of the EU.
If they're going to start putting up enforcement tariffs and all the rest of it, that's a matter for them. Okay. Given that most of their trade is with ourselves and the United States of America, I think they would be very foolish to do that. It's in their interest. The Republic of Ireland
they may see it very differently.
What, they want to have a bad relationship with us?
Let me. So we've had a discussion on your pitch. Dominic Grieve, where would you start in a meeting like this one they had today?
If the Prime Minister can achieve what she set out in her Lancaster House and Florence speeches, why should I complain about it? We would effectively have our cake and eat it. We would have complete access into the single market as if we were still in it. There would be no tariffs because we'd have succeeded in finding a magical way of dealing with it. And at the same time, we wouldn't be bound by those EU regulations that are clearly objectionable to some of my colleagues. That's not the problem. The problem is that logically it is most unlikely that we are going to be able to get that, because the EU will not give it to us because it undermines the EU's integrity.
So your plan, what would you suggest, Theresa?
In those circumstances, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis of where the best benefit for the United Kingdom lies. And the best benefit lies in our ability to trade to the maximum possible in providing goods and services free of regulatory inhibition with our European partners, because they are our closest trading partners, and no other trading partners elsewhere in the world are ever likely to substitute themselves for it.
So that's in the customs union, basically, or a customs union. I'm sorry, I get stuck on these.
It would have to be a customs union if we're out of the single market. All I will say about a customs union, and here I think I disagree, obviously, with Ian Beasley, is that if we are honouring the agreement that we reached in December in outline with the EU on the terms of withdrawal, I find it difficult to see how we will not be in a customs union, because unless somebody comes up with some extraordinary technical way of avoiding the checks which would have to go with it, we will end up with a hard border. Now, I know we don't want a hard border, but actually it isn't completely an issue for the Irish Republic. It's actually an issue for the EU, and the Irish Republic will be forced to have that border, even if they don't want it.
Yes, forced by the EU.
But by the EU, participating members of the EU, and they can't escape that.
Let's get the critics here responding to pluses and minuses of what Dominic Grieve outlined there, Andrew.
OK, so a key plus is that you wouldn't have rules of origin or other kinds of things that created less bureaucracy as you were dealing internally with trade within the European Union. However, you would have your ability to do trade deals externally severely impaired. So that might raise the question of whether you'd really taken back control over trade policy, which might be one of the things people thought they were voting for. I don't think that it really addresses the Irish border question, because if you have different issues of
different regulations on
either side, you still need to check things. So all it does is takes away the tariff question. It doesn't take away the issue of
necessary but not sufficient for the border.
Well, I don't think it's necessary, because I think that whatever would be your solution to the regulatory difference, you would also allow you to check the tariffs. Okay. So I don't think it either solves the question or is a requirement for solving the question.
Jill, the Dominic Grieve option there, is that an option? Because it's Not quite Norway, is it? They keep saying you can have Norway or Canada, nothing in between.
Remember, Norway is in the single market as a member of the EEA. Norway's not in the customs union, and that's why, you know, I think the Norway-Swedish border has been visited by almost every parliamentary select committee and huge numbers of people. I mean, there are checks at the Norway-Sweden border. There are checks at the US-Canada border. They have a free trade agreement. So Norway's not in the customs union. None of those EEA countries, you get a refund if you go and buy something expensive in Iceland. You can get your VAT back at the border because it's not in the customs union. So the question is, do we want to be in both the single market and the customs union? That's what we're in now as an EU member. Obviously, still being part of the single market comes with ECJ jurisdiction, enforcement,
and you're not advocating that. You're just advocating some alignment.
I mean, I have to say that as a lawyer, I'm very conscious of the fact that whatever trade agreement you get into, somebody's around to arbitrate it. And the obsession we have with the European Court of Justice seems to me to slightly miss the point, although I do understand that direct effect has a particular problem
we have
for
very
many
little
in this
time.
country.
Very little time. I want to see, because it sounds like we're miles apart. The two of you are just.
I actually don't think it is. But my big fear is that I think.
Can I offer a solution here? That you have a customs union for goods, the things that actually cross the border, the physical products, and you have complete freedom to negotiate new trade deals on services.
If we're outside the single market, I don't think we're going to get a customs union for services anyway. Right. So actually, I think we're really talking about one for goods in the context of Ireland, and indeed, therefore, for the whole of us. I mean, these are very complex issues of detail. I'm not saying they're insoluble, but they are complicated, and I do worry that it seems to me that we simplify them and then we somehow get surprised when they become very difficult to resolve.
This happens all over the world between countries that are out with the EU all of the time. This is not a major issue that should stop us actually doing trade. It will allow trade to continue. My fear is that unfortunately what you say appears to be that we've given up on Britain and the British people getting on with it and making a great trade deal going forward. That's the downside in what you're saying. We shouldn't give up on the British people.
Can your party survive this, Dominic Grieve? I mean, you would...
I very much hope so, but I do recognise that there are deep divisions. There's no point in trying to pretend they don't exist.
You couldn't serve. Anna Soubry said on this press she couldn't serve under Jacob Rees-Mogg's leader. You couldn't serve under him if he was
I'm not. Well, though that's a hypothetical. You know, ultimately, political parties are held together not necessarily by people agreeing with each other on everything, but by ties of loyalty and affection. Clearly, there can come a point in a party's process where the ties of loyalty and affection get so stretched that it snaps, and that's when a party starts to fall apart. And of course, the difficulty is that we are a party which historically has been very pragmatic in its approach to problems, and we have just introduced, by a revolutionary means of a referendum, a deep ideological division. And for a pragmatic party to get over that and absorb the ideological division and then come together to deliver pragmatic government is clearly an immense challenge. But then look at Labour. They are as equally divided. They're all over the place, and they can't answer any of the similar questions about what they want.
Yes, but if you put the country first and not the party, all I've heard about tonight is the party. Put the country first, the interests of our traders, the interests of our people, and we will get over this. Okay. You have to get over it.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Both of our experts. Thank you so much. Thanks.